Today we're going to be looking at something that if you're new to CSS, you probably haven't seen this before. You probably haven't used this before. So what we're going to be looking at today is going to move your CSS skill from one level to another. We're going to look at a combination, a CSS combination that you can use for automatic numbering, and it comes in handy in a lot of cases. For example, what we are seeing here on the screen is a blog post, and this blog post is, is titled Top 5 Ways to Make Your Website Accessible. By the way, I have a topic on the channel that says 10 ways to make your website accessible. So I'm going to recommend that you take a look at that just on the side. But let's look at this. Now you see that this is numbered, okay? You have number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then something interesting here is that you have 2.1. Now we have the H2s, and then you're going to have your H3. Now these are subheading under this H2, and you have, since this is number 2, we have 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. So how do you set this up? Now, if you're working maybe with a page builder and then you want to manually do this, I can see some people doing this manually. So they're just going to go type in stuff like this. And then if they have to add another H3, they're going to add, they're going to keep on typing and typing and typing. But let's see what happens here. So if I go to my inspection tool and then I want to inspect this, you see, so this is my H3, and then I'm going to select that H3 and I want to duplicate it. So if I duplicate it, you see automatically we have 2.4. If I duplicate this, automatically we have 2.5. So you can see that this is automatic. It's not something that is done manually. So you see, you really don't have to go in and do this one after the other by adding this. And if you're working with a page builder, you probably would want to go in and add a div, add a text here, and then maybe you style it, give it a class and all that. You really don't need to do any of that. At the end of this video, you're going to see how to combine the CSS pseudo element, the before element, the before pseudo element, and the CSS counters to achieve something like this. In my previous videos, I did something similar to this. This is exactly what I did, and I did not use this technique that I'm telling you about. What I used was I used the data attribute to give this numbering. So now somebody pointed out in the channel and said, why didn't you use the counters? Do you think, what do you think? You think the counter is a better option? I said, yes, that was my response. My response was the counter was the most ideal, or is the most ideal, method to do this type of thing. Now, what I did here was to use the pseudo elements. Now, but I used the data attribute to insert these numbers. And what data attribute does is this. Now, we have this. Now, we have this div, and this div has a data attribute of data text 1. And you can see that if you check the before of this div, which is this circle, you're going to see that the content text is value from the data attribute. So you have attribute data text, which is 1, and the same thing, the next one does the same thing. So if we go to the next one, we're going to see data text 2. So if I change this to let's say 3, or let's say 6, you can see it changes because it is being fed from the data attribute. Now let me undo that. Now the downside of using data attribute here is that if I want to swap this around, okay, so let's say I want to swap this, move this around. So I'm saying, okay, I want the example data to be number 1, okay, to be the first one. Now if I move that to the first, you can see it takes the number with it, and then I have to go in to manually change that, which, to be frank, wasn't the most ideal way to do this. I mean, I was just mostly concerned about the layout in that tutorial. I really wasn't giving much thought to this, and I actually was talking about scalability, which in a way is a really big downside in terms of scalability. So my apologies to those that watched that tutorial, and if you haven't seen it, please go ahead and see how I set this up. Very interesting tutorial. Let me just go ahead and refresh this. Now we're going to go in to learn the CSS counter combination with the before pseudo element, and see how we can get this to work in the best way possible. So now I have, let's start with the clean, a clean slate. All right. So I have a blog post here. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're using a Gutenberg, whether you're using a page builder or whatever you're using, you're coding it manually. This works regardless. Okay. So because it's pure CSS, so it works regardless. All you need is the CSS selector. So what is the CSS counter? You may already be familiar with the CSS pseudo element, which is the before element. It's the pseudo element is an element in CSS that you can use in adding content to your HTML element without an additional markup like the before element. We're going to see it here. But the CSS counters are like variables. The variables are incremented by CSS rules, which is used to track how many times the counter is being used, and it resets it once it's finished tracking and then continues. Confusing, right? Yeah, but it's good to just go ahead and demonstrate it. Now, to use a counter, you have to first of all define to create the counter. But before that, I want to say that to use the CSS counter, you have to use it with 4 properties, and those properties are the counter reset. Now, the counter reset creates or resets the counter. Then you have to look at the counter increment, which increments a counter value. Then you have to look at the content. Now, this content works with the pseudo element content, like the before or after content. And then finally, you have to the fourth property is the counter, which is the counter function, which add the value of a counter to an element. Now, to use the CSS counter, the first thing we want to do is to create that counter. Now, you create that counter within a context, within a selector. That selector will define the context. So what I want to do is to create the counter within the context of this blog post. Now, this blog post has a wrapper. Now, if you created this manually, you would have already known the class you've given to the wrapper, but because I'm using Gutenberg, I have to check the wrapper for the whole blog post, and I'm going to select that this looks like the wrapper, okay, but this looks like the wrapper for the body of the article, okay. So this is it, and my wrapper is called you have different classes. If you go here, you will see the different classes and all that, but then I'm particularly interested in the class called WP blog post content, because this is very specific to the blog post. These other ones might be related to other contents, but this is specifically, related to the blog post. So I think this is the right one for me to use, and I'm going to copy that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the style sheet editor, the style editor, and then I'm going to paste that class, and then I'm going to create my counter within that context. And to create my counter, what I want to do is write counter reset, and then my counter reset, I want to give it a number. I want to give it a name, and you can give it any name you want. So for my name, I want to use this counter to style my H2. So I'm just simply going to call it H2. That's all. I'm going to call it H2. That is it. So I want to style my H2. So that is how you create a counter. So I've created a counter called H2. And now creating a counter within this block means that that counter is created within this block, and it resets in the context of that block, meaning that if you go outside of that block and this counter is to be used again, it's going to start counting afresh, let's say from 1 instead of continuing. Okay. Now the next thing is to define, to get a pseudo element. So now we want to apply this counter to the H2. Okay. We want to apply it to all the H2. So I'm going to select all the H2s inside these WP blog post content, but I want to select the before. Okay. And the first thing you want to do, there's a double. Okay. The first thing you want to do when you want to work with a pseudo element, the before element, is to define the content. Without the content, the before element or the pseudo element doesn't exist. So let's the before and after specifically. Now I'm going to write content, and then first of all, I'm just going to give it a double quotation mark, which will give me basically creates the before element. But I always like writing something like maybe hello, just to be sure. So you can see that the space also is recognized as an element. So you can see I have my hello here now. But I don't want to use hello, okay? I don't want to use hello. I want to use the counter. I want it to have a counter. So instead of writing just hello, I'm just going to write counter, and then I'm going to open and close a bracket. And then in my counter, the name I'm going to pass in to that counter is going to be my h2. As you can see that it gives me a counter, but it's 0, 0, you know, they're all zeros. Now, that is because I've inserted a counter, but I've not incremented it. So to increment it, I'm going to add a property called counter increment, and that will increment the counter. And what you pass there is the name of the counter you want to increment. So I want to increment still the h2. You see, this is the counter I created. I still want to increment the same counter, and then it shows 1, 2, 3. Okay, you can see that it is adding that counter to all my h2s. Now, one thing with the counter is that the content, you know, property is that you can actually add multiple content. For example, now I want to add, let's say I can just go with my double quotation mark here, and then I can say number, and you see it adds number. So you see number 1, or that number 1, or I could add a hash, so you can see it just gives that. And then I can come here and add another content, and that content I just want to add a space. Now it just gives that space. If you want to add a semicolon, a space, you have it. So I'm just going to leave it at a space. Now I'm going to go ahead and style this. Okay, so we have number 1, number 2, number 3, and all that. But then that is just to show you that you can have that. But I don't want to have a number, so I don't want to have that. I just want to have 1. Okay. And let me just take this. Let's leave that for now. But anyway, let me take it off. Okay, so, but I want to go ahead and style it. All right. So I'm just going to give it a font weight of say 800. Too much, 700. Okay, so that works. But I still feel I should add that. Okay, let me just add that space. Okay, so you have 1, 2, let's just make it number, yep, that. Sorry for going back and forth. I just feel it looks better, you know, like this. Anyway, so I'm just gonna give it a color. My color is gonna be, let's say, orange red. Let me just choose orange red. Basically, that just, you know, that already looks good. It looks okay, you know. And so we're basically done with that. So that's it, right? Okay, so there's a lot more you can do. For example, in this one, this is how do you get a styling like this? You can go ahead to keep styling this, and then to get, you know, that styling. So to do that, I'm just going to remove this. Okay, I already said I wasn't going to use that, so I'm just going to remove it. And then I'm going to give this a background color instead. So instead of background, I'm going to give it a background color. And then my color now will be white. Okay, so I have a color of white, but I want to have a width to it. So I have a width of, let's say, 50 pixel, but the width doesn't apply. Okay, but just let me just continue. Aspect ratio, my aspect ratio is going to be 1 because I don't want to set width and height all the time. Okay, now the reason the width is not applied is because this is just places, this content is just placed together with the text, so the width is not going to be respected. Now to get the width to be respected, now if I give it a position of absolute, you can see that the width is respected, but we don't want position absolute because it's going to take it out of the document flow and it's going to overlap the contents. So another way you could make it respect the width is by giving it a display property. Now I want it to display. Now if you say a display of, now you want it to display, continue to display inline, you want to give it a display property that makes it to display inline. So I'm just going to say inline, but inline wouldn't work. So you could either use inline flex or you could use you know, inline grid, but I'll prefer to use inline grid. Now the reason is because it's much easier to center the items in with grid. So I'm just going to say place items, okay, center, and then that just brings that to that number to the very middle. And then I'm just going to give it a margin right. Margin right, I'll say 2 rem, and that we have a border radius. The border radius is going to give it 100%, make it completely round. So so you can see that we have that. So you could go ahead and style this anyhow you want to style it. Now, so how do we get this? How do we get the 2.1, 2.2 for the subtitles here? Now, to get that, we have to create a new counter, and that counter we want to create it for our H3. Now, so I'm going to take this, I'm going to paste this, and then, but what I want is to define it for the H2. Now you may wonder, we want to create a counter for H2, so why we define it for H2? Now, because we want a counter that will reset at every H2. So we want a counter, we want to create another counter called H3, okay? And that counter is defined within the context of the H2s. So every time you meet an H, so what it's saying is that every time you meet an H2, start a new counter and then reset that counter once you meet a new one. So it's going to always create, that counter is always going to exist within the context of all the H2s in this document or in this, class, in this container. Now, to do that, I'm just going to copy this, and then this will be H3 before. Okay. Now, so what I'm going to do is my content, first of all. So content, the content is going to be a counter, and that counter is going to be the H3 that I created. So you see it is already showing 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay. Now we want to increment it. So I'm going to say counter increment. Now the counter increment will be for the H3 counter that we used. Okay. So it's, you see we have 1, 2, 3. Okay. And now for this counter, I want to give it a space. So I'm going to create a space, a content for the space. So you can see it just gives me a space. But what I want is not 1, 2, 3. I want 2.1, 2.2. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to copy this counter, the H2, and then I'm going to paste it here. But I want to add a dot. So I'm going to create another content and put a dot there. So you can see that it gives you, so what you're seeing here is counter H2 dot counter H3. So the H2 still remains 2, 2, 2, because this counter increment references the H3, which is defined within the H2. So the increment will keep happening as long as it is under this H2. Okay. So that is why we have 1, 2, 3. So we have that. And then I'm just going to say font weight. Font weight is going to be 600 and maybe 700. Still same. Yep. So you see, this looks great. This looks, you can use this to do a lot of things. You can use this to have real complex numbering. If you understand how to, let's say, nest these counters the way I'm doing it here. So this is kind of like you're nesting the, the H3 counter within the H2, block. Okay. So these are the kind of things that if you're working with Gutenberg, you could style this whichever way you want. Now let's go back to this now. So I said earlier that what I used here was data attribute. And the problem with this was if you had to move this around, if I move example data is, you're going to have number 4 here. Now we want to change that. So you could use this. Now, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that it's not just for Gutenberg, content. So if you're building out a layout like this in a builder and you want to have numbers, sometimes you have these fancy numbers like number 1 big at the background, faint, number 2 big. So things like that, you don't need to put them manually, because as you keep adding content, you want the numbering to be automatic. You want it to, to be numbered automatically. So what I'm going to do now is I want to quickly move let me just move my picture away from here. Okay. Now what I want to do now is I want to take a look at this counter which was this. We don't have a counter actually. So what we have here is this. Okay. Now the before, let's try to move this. You can see that the content was defined with a data attribute. So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to remove that. Okay. I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to define a counter. Now I want to define that counter within this section, just a section. So I'm just going to define it within a section. So what I'm saying is that create and reset this counter in every section in this case. So this section, I'm going to write the CSS here, counter reset. The counter reset, I'm just going to call it, I'm just going to call it counts, just to count number, whatever, So let's go back here. And then my content now is going to be counter. And then I'm going to pass in the name of that counter. It's called count. Okay. And then to increment it, I'm just going to say counter increment, just add a new property, counter increment count. And that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4. Now look at what is going to happen here. Now, if I decide to move example data to number 1, you see, it doesn't take the 4 with it. It just goes to number 1. If I decide to move this around. So this is the most ideal way of dealing with this issue. So right now, we really do not need this data attribute anymore. So because this, to be frank, wasn't the most ideal way. So this is kind of like a follow-up to the previous tutorial. So if you had watched this tutorial and you use this method, so you know that you don't have to add this data attribute anymore. You just use the counter. Now let's go in one level deeper. Okay, I'm just going to show you one extra thing to take home with, okay, for staying up till now. And but before I show you this extra thing, if you like this video, please hit the like button, like thumbs up. Okay, just do that, thumbs up. And that's all I'm asking. I'm not even asking you to subscribe. I'm not asking you to subscribe, okay, but you can go ahead and subscribe, but just hit the thumbs up. All right, and then you can say something in the comment section. Let me know if you found it useful. Now, the last thing I want to do is, what if you wanted to use, you don't want to use numbers. Let's say you want to use A, B, C, or you want to use like the Roman numerals. You can still do that. So what I'm going to do here for the H2, I'm going to go in here. Now we have defined the content should be our counter H2. And then I'm just going to go in, put in a comma here. Now I'm going to define the type of counter that I want. And I want upper alpha. And then it's going to change that to A, B, C, D. It just does that. Okay. And now, of course, that screws this up. Now, if I'm going to be doing that, then I don't want this type. Again, I don't want to have a B and then 2.1. So I'm going to go to that, and I'm just going to take off that H2, that counter 2. All right. And here for the H3, I want to have the Roman numeral. So I'm just going to put a comma, but I want to have lower dash Roman. So now I have my Roman. It doesn't look so good with with the 500 or 700. Yeah. So I have my Roman, and I think I could just wrap it in bracket. And to do that, remember that you can create content. So I'm going to close my bracket here, and then I'm just going to also do the same thing, open my bracket. All right, so so you see that I can have that, but then we still need a space. So after this, I want to just add a space. Okay, so you can see that I still have, so this defines just a completely new style. So you can have upper alpha. If you want lower alpha, you could use lower alpha. If you want upper Roman, you could go upper Roman, and just so I just prefer the lower upper the way I did it before. And that is it, guys. That brings an end to today's tutorial. If you love this tutorial, please hit the thumbs up and share this video with others so they can see it, so they can also learn from it. So next time you want to do something like this, you know exactly what to do. You can see the CSS is just very few. You could put this, anywhere in your code editor, in your style sheet, wherever. It's just, you could even create a utility class for this. ACSS, take note. All right. So that's all for today. Until next time, have a great day.